Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Greg. Let's get on to the first slide on this one. So, about me, I've worked in civil service and in government kind of my whole career. First of all with Ministry of Defence and then with National Crime Agency. And I now work for the Ministry of Justice. And I still work for the National Crime Agency as a cyber special. So I kind of quite enjoy working in government because you get to see lots of interesting things. So my talk today is really a little bit kind of walking you through the scenarios about how you can break into a data centre and avoiding the standard kind of route going for AD type credentials and looking at different attack vectors to get into the systems and kind of walking through how we could go about doing that. I'm working with a vendor at the moment as well to disclose some of the issues within this, so I can't go into too much technical, well, I can't really go into technical detail at the moment with it. But the scenario is built around two fictional companies we've got here. So we've got the very big corporation of America, which is kind of our ultimate target of where we want to get to. Now they're a big conglomerate. They've got lots of smaller companies beneath them. They care about security because it's part of their business model, and they don't want to be compromised. But as a large enterprise, they rely on lots of smaller service providers. So we've got Acme Tech, which provides services for them as one of those providers. Now their main part within this is to provide them with voice and video services and conferencing facilities in this scenario. So that's kind of the two companies we've got there, and we want to break into the big corporation here. Does anyone know the reference to the very big corporation of America? Target. Well, it's a Target, but if anyone's seen The Meaning of Life, this is the company that's featured in that one. So how do we find a route in? So it's most likely in the big corporation they're going to use some of their own physical data centres. Now from a physical perspective they're pretty well protected. We could try and break into the data centre, but that's going to be quite messy to do that. We've got to go through getting passes. We've got all the CCTV there, and it's quite a high risk strategy to try and use that type of approach to get in. And if we want to get into the data centre and we get caught doing something, then the chances are we're going to be arrested and we don't want to be caught hands on the equipment. So we need to find a different route in, which is where our remote attack route will come in, and this is kind of your typical red team type scenario. So anyone who went along to Vincent and Dom's talk this morning, this is kind of sort of similar in nature as to what you'll be trying to do. So how can we target them? How can we find a way into these environments and find a way to target the big corporation, but use the smaller company to leverage a way in and give us a way to pivot into that organisation? So we don't want to be using our traditional sort of think too traditionally about how we're going to get through. So we've got to think a bit more creatively about how we can break in. So we know Acme Tech is a service provider for them, so how can we find out more to leverage our way in? So we can start to observe how those employees work at their company. Could we get some physical access into Acme Tech? Because if they're a smaller provider, are they based in a small office location? Are they based in a city centre? Could we get access to their premises to put an implant in there, or have some way of breaking in that way to get us an initial foothold or gather some further intelligence? Can we look at their social media presence and their job adverts that are online and find out what technologies they're using internally? And start to look at, as we start to build up more knowledge around them, is using tools like I mentioned earlier on with Harvester for gathering some of the credentials around their social media profiles and understanding how they operate. So can we start to think about building up potential password lists, customised password lists that we could use to break into those organisations? And can we use their company website for some passive recon to work out how we could break through into their organisation and work out who we should be targeting, whether that be from like LinkedIn profiles and trying to understand how they work. And then we can start to look a bit more at the DNS records behind it, so understanding what exposure they've got to their systems on the internet and how we can find out more about that. So it might be quite overt, they've got their company website there that they operate, but is there information you can get from the DNS so you can start to pivot across and identify other services they're running which may not be public facing in effect? So could you identify some of their remote management portals? Could you identify out of bound management routes? So you can use things like Showdown and Scans.io and the Rapid7 DNS database to start, or for DNS database to start looking at how these records tie up, and using passive DNS records potentially to find some of this sort of stuff out. And you can move on to your passive recon from that perspective before you start doing more active work. So the The other ones that people probably don't think about so much is using tender documents that companies have put out. So where they're advertising in company journals to say, we need you to come and supply us this system and it's built on this stack and we need you to do this, that and the other. So it might give you really intricate details around how their company works, what technologies they're using, where their systems are located and how they're operating. And from a commercial perspective, they have to give this information out and it has to be available to companies to tender for it. So it can be quite a good goldmine of information from that perspective. So we've done this passive recon and we're starting to work through and understand what we can do in that environment. So we need to start finding the needle within all that information and find our initial route in. So as we said at the start, like breaking into the data center isn't practical and it's pretty high risk strategy to try and do that. So can we identify an administrator in that environment or someone that we can use to escalate privileges in that environment? Can we identify a backup service where we can get access to the backups they've got on there? If they're backing up into, say, Amazon S3, are they protecting their backups well? Can we download and access those by doing our passive recon? Or have they been lax with their coding and published API keys into GitHub or given away some of their secrets so we can get access in? And also the remote access functions I have in there and the sort of administration portals. So with a lot of servers nowadays, you'll have ILO or iDRAC type management on those machines so that you can remote in to have access to the physical machine and maintain the firmware it's on there, the BIOS, and configure the networking and such like. So if they've got a way of managing that out of band, can we get access in via that route and take over the tin rather than trying to go in via a user account route? So we've gathered our passive recon, so we can use something like a phishing email potentially to break into one of the user accounts and get an initial access in. I'm going to give a little plug now to the Nestitude Challenge Next, this is kind of based around getting initial access in. So if you're not going along to that one, I'd certainly recommend it. And then we need to try and, once we've got access into Acme, so in this situation, we'll assume that we've been able to get a level of access into that company, and we've got access within the Acme environment, and we've used, say, the traditional routes of using AD within that environment, which isn't our main target. So Acme Tech, as they're an SME, have not necessarily as au fait on the security practices and have as much budget to do that. So what can we do from there? So we need to try and pivot through Acme into Big Tech Corp. So as I said at the start, Acme are providing the voice and video services for a number of different customers, not just Acme Tech, not just Big Tech Corp. So they have access into these customer systems to maintain those environments and do the configuration on behalf of the Big Tech Corp. So within that environment, they're going to have access into some of their networking equipment, which will be segregated off from their main networks. So how can we use that to leverage our access and move further through the systems? I have a little bit of a segue through into a different area now because did anyone go to the Cisco ASA talk this morning? No. Oh yeah. So we'll talk about the heap overflows in the talk this morning, but vendors are just generally quite marketing driven and sales led. So if someone in the marketplace over here does this new Wizzy feature, they want to have that Wizzy feature in their new product as well. And their time to market is the most important thing for them. So the security is going to be bypassed a little bit at that point, or they'll say, "Oh, we'll come back and revisit that." So this is where a lot of the weaknesses come in from a security perspective, and it's quite common across the industry that this will be the case. And it's generally the sales and marketing side will win out over necessarily having the technical controls in there at the start, and it'll be okay. We can add that bit in later on because no one's going to find that out. So let's assume we've got the access there. So let's have a look at what controls are in there with that vendor. So the big technology corp that we've got there, we've got an access into Acme. So we can start to orientate ourselves in that environment and understand what technologies they're using and what equipment they're using in that environment. So we can start to do our passive recon now we've moved to the next stage. And we can start to look at where we can find potential vulnerabilities. Now, in this case, I'm looking more towards the networking perspective as opposed to a Windows environment. So we're managing their video conferencing, their voice phones. So we're not necessarily a Windows environment or a domain joined environment at this point. So how can we go on and find a route in to escalate our access within their networks? So from the perspective of the networking side, the maturity of network operations is nowhere near as good as the DevOps approach. So in DevOps, people understand infrastructure as code and understand doing the testing behind the scenes when they're building, well, in general, when they're building new software and putting it together. Whereas from the network operations side, this is quite new, and the network vendors aren't necessarily as au fait in those types of practices in the software development work that goes on. So from that perspective, they're adding these new features into their core networking equipment without necessarily understanding what the implications are in that environment and how they need to secure that. So if you think of things like Puppet and Ansible and Chef, these features are all coming into the networking equipment, so you can start to automate how you configure all your networks and the software-defined network approach, which has its benefits as well, but it means that there's another attack vector within that network environment, and you're starting to sort of blur the boundaries between a networking device and a server or your application code as well. So this is where we need to start doing some more research again. So we've got access into our environment, and we've got access to what are the network switches for the administration that we're doing. So what are the chances that they're using similar network credentials on other devices? Can we use that as a potential route to pivot across in the network and find access further into their environments? Can we look at using VLAN hopping to break out of those environments and get onto other segments within their networks and start to be able to intercept the traffic that's going across the networks, or using the network routing protocols, so like ERGRP or OSPF, to redirect where the traffic's being routed within the environments. So at this point, you need to start doing a lot more research and understanding how that equipment's put together. So within the Acme Tech, we've got access to one of their core network switches to manage the configuration for their network devices. So within a data center, you'll typically have a core network switch in the center, and then you have different top of rack type switches within those environments, which you'll use for routing the traffic between the data center and where it needs to go for the end user devices. And within those, I'll have the associated ACLs and network routing configurations, and they'll be separated out most likely into different VLANs. So we know that this is available to us, so we can start to understand and enumerate where we could potentially exploit the sort of the data center switch. Excuse me. So this is where we need to start doing some more research about how that switch functions. So looking at the vendor documentation and the RFCs behind those standards and how they operate. And it does get a relatively low level about the detail of how they operate and trying to find a way of breaking in. And if you can get access to the firmware for the switch, so go to the vendor's site and download a copy of the firmware so you can start to inspect it and try and understand what vulnerabilities lay within that firmware. So if you get access to that firmware, you can then use tools like binwalk to look through the binary to understand how it's packed. So the next step is then to start doing some analysis about how that firmware operates, what binaries it uses, and potential routes into that environment you can use to escalate your privileges on that switch. But ultimately, these switches are just, most of them are Linux underneath, ultimately. The ASAs run Linux underneath, as do many other vendors. So you've got the likes of Cisco and Brocade and HP and Juniper all build switches with these types of functions in them that have a virtualization layer built into them. So you can, in effect, have one single physical switch with multiple virtual instances of switches within it. And the same with firewall contexts on the ASA, so you can have virtual firewall contexts. So one physical device, but virtualized operating systems within those as well, in much the same way that you would do with traditional virtualization. So this kind of gives you kind of a bit of an illustration. So I've shamelessly stolen the diagram from the Venom, CrowdStrike Venom exploit, which the diagram quite well illustrates kind of what we're trying to achieve. So if you imagine this is a data center switch as opposed to a virtual environment, a traditional like virtualized server, we've got access to one of these VMs, and we want to try and break out of that and take over the networking environment within the data center and start to be able to sniff all the traffic that's going through and be quite covert and exfiltrate data out. So this is kind of an approach you want to take for long-term access. So as we've got access to our firmware, we can start to do the static analysis of the binaries that are there and work out what it's using. So are there typical SUID or GUID binaries on there that you can use to escalate your privileges on that switch if you can run those commands? can you find ways of breaking out of the vendor's command shell? Because they'll typically have a locked-down set of commands that you can run within their environment, but that's ultimately just a sandbox around the overall Linux operating system it's running within. So can we find a way of breaking out of that environment and getting through? So when I was doing this work, I found tools like Qemu and GNS3, which are a couple of Qemu is based on Qemu and KVM are quite similar virtualization technologies. They're forks of one another. And GNS3 is a tool that you can use to run networking labs, so you can spin up different instances of switches or firewalls to look at how the command lines work and how those networks operate and build your own virtual environment to work in. So I use those to understand how these systems work and how they're built. And they're not as fully featured, but it helps you understand how they're put together. So I also took the firmware and extracted out the binaries from that and mounted it locally on my machine. So I had to take the binary using binwalk to extract out the firmware and then identify how it's put together. So within the images I was looking at, you had kickstart images in there, and then you had the various binaries that made up that kickstart to do the boot. So you could use that, and with using binwalk to identify the file offsets, where those different parts of the images were, you could then mount those via a loopback on a Linux machine to then mount the file system that you could then examine. And by looking through that, you can understand where the binaries were within that system, what the commands were, and start to look at the ELF binaries within it, and understand what the commands, or at a high level, understand what the commands do and how they operate, to sort of get an inkling of where your attack routes might be. And you can also understand if they're running vulnerable or old versions of code at that point as well, because you've got the actual firmware there. You can see if they're running old versions of Linux kernels or if they're running vulnerable versions of software in that environment. You also then have the opportunity to look at the typical etc shadow files and the password files to see if you can identify a vulnerable account or accounts that would have default credentials that you could use to break in. So from that perspective, I was able to use that to leverage an exploit which enabled me to break out from this VM, like the virtualization layer here, into the hypervisor context here. And by breaking out into that hypervisor, I was then able to have access across the different environments and view the files within those. But that initial exploit that I had didn't give me a privileged level of access on the machine, so I was still restricted to the control I had in this VM here, but I could see the other users' files and see the firmware images that are there. So one of the attack routes I could have there is to drop in a different firmware image or keep an eye on when an administrator connected into the machine and subvert where the files are put within the environment. So I could potentially trick an administrator into loading a malicious firmware onto that machine and getting a higher level of access that way. But also, you could look at potentially seeing if you can break back into these other virtual machines and have access to those VMs and take over that environment, which then means you can potentially start to get access to other customers' areas and other parts of the business that you shouldn't have access to, which then means you can start to observe and exfiltrate data potentially and get that out from the environment. It's relatively high level at the moment, kind of due to the nature of working with a vendor. I can't go into the technical details of exactly how to do it. This is kind of an overview of sort of the attack approach I use, which is very similar to what they did in the sort of the Venom approach here. So once you get access to the network environment and you can get access to the administrative control of the switch, you can take over that entire network and start to look at all the traffic and exfiltrate data at will, really. So you can set up a covert channel out and start to exfiltrate data out in slower time. So that's kind of gives a really high level overview of where we are. So summing up where we've got to, we've gained access into Acme Tech via some weak credentials or a phishing email to an administrator, and have been able to use that access to break through into the bigger corporation, as there's an assumed level of trust between those two corporations. So the big tech corporation will have a hard exterior, which have a lot of control around it. But its SMEs, because of the nature of doing business with them, are going to have softer boundaries, so we can find another route into those environments. And then we can then start to leverage that access to pivot around that organisation and get further through. So what could we do next? So we could take over other companies that trust that environment as well. So if we've got access in the centre of the environment, we can then start to use that to pivot out to other companies that are working with them as well, and potentially use that to leverage access across a wider range of businesses. And we can exfiltrate trade secrets, or we could just completely take over that organisation and destroy their business by taking them down or doing them really bad reputational damage. If you think of something like the Sony hacks, with the damage that was done there. So that kind of sums up where we've got to. I'm hoping that the vulnerability with the vendor will be disclosed in the next 2 to 3 months, in which time I'll be able to start writing up some details of how you go about doing this and what I found out in doing it. And kind of what I've learned along the way with the vulnerability disclosure is that the companies aren't that proactive at solving these types of things until they're pushed. Initially, when I disclosed this to the company, they were reluctant to do anything about it, and they denied that it was an issue. And it was only with some persistence they took it forward and started to look at fixing it. But what I have learned from this as well is don't just limit yourself to looking at that current version of code. So if they've got multiple code branches and you find there's exploits or vulnerabilities in other code branches, try those in the other version branches as well, because the chances are they may not have fixed those branches. So the experience I've found on this one is that they're fixing it in a newer code branch and a newer version, but they're not fixing the code branch that the vulnerability was actually discovered on. And it's not obvious until you actually go through this process with them just how they work. So that's kind of what I've learned from this, and that brings me to the end. Are there any questions?
Told us about how you attack. How would you defend? How would you stop these?
So part of what I did was that defence, in all honesty. So the reason that this vulnerability was found in the first place is we were put in place to do an assessment on this environment to understand what the risks were to that environment before it was deployed in a new configuration. Yeah. So by doing this testing, we were able to provide advice to the teams that were going to deploy it to say, well, actually, if you use these features, these are the risks with it and the extra controls that you need to put there. So things that you can do to try and defend against this particular type of compromise is having strong access controls in there, using AAA authentications, limiting administrative access, controlling your changes, monitoring your networks, and just having generally good controls and hygiene around your environments and segregation.
That's on the technical side. What about, this is the third-party support.
Oh, so from a supplier's perspective.
Yeah. Because that's what you're aiming at, isn't it?
Yeah, the supplier perspective, ultimately, I think bug bounties have been quite good from that perspective in the responsible disclosure. I think Google's Project Zero with the 90-day before it's published is quite a good approach, and it incentivises companies to take it seriously and do something about it. Yeah. I think with working with them to fix it, because it required quite a lot of change to their code base to fix it, it was reasonable to wait a bit longer for them to fix it rather than it being put out in the wild and them still not being able to fix it at the start. Pardon me. I don't think it's an uncommon issue across the board, but I don't think there's an easy answer to it. But I think things like bug bounties are good at incentivising it, and if there's more emphasis put on when a vulnerability is found and what it actually means in reality to a business, rather than saying, oh, we found this 8.8 vulnerability in product X, that doesn't mean that much to in layman's terms. So how do you get that into the business language to say to an executive, like, this is what it means, this is the impact on your business, that's why it matters, rather than saying, oh, we found this technical vulnerability and it's really bad. You've got to get it translated into the right business language.
That's another challenge in itself.
Any more questions?
Depending on, obviously, what you're trying to do in the data centre, whether you're exfiltrating data or just cause physical damage, one of the things from my experience in data centre construction is at some point you give up your maintenance to third parties because you don't have to cure and chill it.
Yeah.
Most of those solutions live with external facing front ends, and most of that is straightforward HTTPS, but very, very weak because obviously it's written on a tiny prompt. Chili never has a prompt, has an update ever.
Touched it. Yeah.
And one of the things you didn't cover up, and I didn't know if this is something which has ever happened actually, is has anyone actually tried to take a data center offline just by targeting chili units or the power or something like that?
It's not something I've done myself, but it's certainly an interesting attack vector. I've heard of it being done from a building management perspective and building management systems, but not specifically a data centre.
Usually the data centre would have that much redundancy. It shouldn't. You shouldn't.
Yeah, I wonder if it's a case of testing it.
Easier attack vectors.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a route in. So if you could disrupt it to that amount, I mean, what you probably start to think about doing is seeing if you can get into the substations outside of the data center to disrupt it that way.
That's easier.
Because they're probably going to have less protection from that point of view of the SCADA system. Yeah. There you go. You're doing a talk next year now. Any more for any more? Oh, thanks everyone.